So we are live. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am super excited to be with you. Just as my one of my dogs, Stella, our Belgian Malinois, announces our presence, you can always count on her to be timely. And I'm very, very excited to do this LinkedIn Live with you and share about our mission, but more importantly, to share how we work with Dr. Robert Sanchez, who is an incredible clinician, just amazing. And I'm going to read a little bit about his bio, and then we're going to get into this. So, Dr. Roberto Sanchez is a trained forensic psychologist, licensed mental health counselor, and nationally certified intervention professional with over 33 years of experience in the behavioral healthcare field. He's the founder of Axiom Intervention and Case Management Services, where he and his team provide ethical, individualized, and comprehensive care coordination for families and individuals navigating addiction and complex mental health challenges. Over the past 3 decades, Dr. Sanchez has facilitated hundreds of interventions across the United States and has worked with thousands of families worldwide. His clinical expertise is grounded in empirically supported intervention models, refined through years of experience in addiction treatment centers, inpatient psychiatric hospitals, residential facilities, community mental health programs, and private practice across Texas, Florida, New York, and California. And that's only like 15% of your bio. Otherwise, we'd be here till 1 o'clock. So, Robert, I'm so glad that you're here. Thanks for taking time to chat with us. So, by way of background, a little bit about me. I am, along with my wife, the co-founder of Axiom Law. And in February of 2016, without any money, but with a really focused mission, I launched it was at that time just me, my law firm out of the local library here. They had free Wi-Fi and pretty cheap coffee. And I got the cheapest business cards Vista printers ever made. And I ran around to treatment centers and said, I'm Mark Astor, I'm here to help. And they said, we've never heard of you. And I said, I know you haven't heard of me, but you will very soon. And I spent the next 14 months taking all kinds of cases, none of which had anything to do with what we do now, because I needed to pay some bills. And 11 months in, I lost my dad. And so it was a trying time for us. But after about 6 months of taking different kinds of cases, I got a tiny, tiny office, which was just a little bit bigger than the desk that sat in it. So I had enough room to scoot around and sit at the desk. And then I met my wife the second year. She's now my wife. She wasn't at the time. And really just spent 7 years hustling and building our business. And it's only been the last 3 years that we've had some staff, which means I can sit here and the phone doesn't ring too much. My staff still call me, but we're very blessed. We have a team of 12, should be closer to 14 by the end of the year. And so our mission, which has always been to save families whose loved ones are suffering from substance use, mental health disorders, and failed attempts at recovery. Now, in order to accomplish that goal, there's really 3 components that we use. There's the legal component, there's clinical, and then there's what I call law enforcement. And so here in Florida, we operate under 3 statutes: Marchman Act, Guardianship, and Baker Act. And depending on the case, as Robert will tell you, we might be operating under all 3. So that means we have to be running to 3 different courtrooms, seeing 3 different judges, potentially dealing with different attorneys, and things can get a little hectic. But when you understand how these 3 laws all really work together, because they have a common thread, that enables you to potentially get control of what is usually an out-of-control situation. The second part is the clinical, and we're going to talk to Robert about that in a second, because getting somebody into a clinically appropriate facility for long enough, which is where the whole legal process comes in, is key and critical to saving not only them, but their family. And then the third component is what we call law enforcement. So I have a retired cop on staff. Big John, as we call him, is a retired federal agent, and he's got a team of investigators. And he's really critical for us because we got a lot of calls for people that go missing. They walk out of treatment. They're on the streets. And while we're big fans of the men and women who wear the uniform, they don't always have the resources all the time to go looking for our patients, right? So we have John and his team do it for us. And if we can get a pickup order from a judge, which we're pretty good at doing, then we can call the cops in and say, hey, we have this court order here. Can you please come and meet our investigator and pick this person up so we can get them to a place of safety? So that is sort of what we do in a nutshell. But the clinical piece, which has really changed things tremendously for us, especially since COVID and the legalization of marijuana, has been, I think, the key to the success and the results that we get. So, Robert, I'm so happy you're here. I don't even know where to start with you because there's so many different things that you do. But let's give the folks just a little bit of background about how you got here and what you actually do for us and our patients and the clients that we work with.
Yeah, so my career started 33 years ago. I don't think that I planned to end here. It's just kind of the way that it went. And you kind of talked about my bio. I'd love to talk a little bit less about me and more about what we do. But again, thanks for having me on the show. And just I always love collaborating with like-minded professionals around the country. And Mark, I hold you in high regard. So. The work that we do essentially entails, we get calls from families that are in crisis, whether it's a medical challenge or a mental health problem or a substance abuse problem, usually a combination therein. And we put plans together. So the first part of that process, of course, is talking to all the family members, gathering ancillary information from medical records to previous psychiatric hospitalizations, if that's the case, or even psychological testing from childhood, whatever corroborating data we can kind of put together to figure out where this person lands in the way of a diagnosis and what the hypothesis is about the etiology of whatever the presenting problem is. Once we do that, oftentimes we know, because families come to us after usually many years of trying to get their loved ones help. And so oftentimes we realize that this is someone who is not capable of making good decisions for themselves, or not capable of even agreeing possibly in an intervention, depending on the type of profile. And so oftentimes then we call you so that we can then work a case together and kind of look at, okay, do we need to Baker Act this person to get them safe? Do we need to look at a Marchman Act if there's enough substance abuse? Or do we need to look at guardianship if this person is just not capable of making good decisions for themselves and putting themselves in harm's way, up into including possible death in a lot of these cases? And so once we've kind of taken care of the front end data gathering and have formulated a semblance of what we all believe using information from other professionals, and we're very meticulous about that particular process, then we start to look at, okay, what are the viable solutions? And we present those solutions to the families, often using legal mediums when necessary, and also helping them find the right facility. We believe that, putting a patient in a facility that specializes in this type of care or that type of care is vital. It's crucial to sort of making sure that the patient gets good care once we are able to get them in safe and secure. The other part of that equation is that once they are released, that there's a good discharge plan in place. I think that is often overlooked by various sectors of our field. People really focus on getting the crisis stabilized, but sometimes, and even families, they relax, the patient is better, and they think that this is over. But as you well know, usually there's a process that requires sort of ongoing care. And so those are all the different things that we kind of do when a family calls us. And what kind of separates us, I believe, from some people anyway, is our level of training, our sort of acumen in the clinical space, and just understanding a diagnostic profile and who does what well. And so we love the work we do. We love working with families. And, one of our passions is just taking a case from crisis and watching everybody really get back to a place of some semblance of normalcy, and having a good plan in place, and hearing from those families later how well things are going. It's not always that linear. Sometimes it can be messy because there's just a lot of moving parts in our field. But we are very passionate about the work that we do. It doesn't feel like work to us. It feels very natural. And we're just super excited to be able to have the privilege and the honor of working with these families. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. And I should tell the audience, by the way, if you guys have questions, pop them into the chat. We'll see them and we'll answer them live. My father, when he was alive, used to tell me that nobody ever wanted to call a lawyer, and they certainly don't want to give us any money. So if they call us, it's because they're desperate. And he always said, you have to honor that and respect it. The typical client that we get has probably Yeah, and when I say client, I'm talking about it's usually the parents. That's our sort of typical client. And my wife always says to me that, I make all the mothers cry. I don't try to make the mothers cry, but it's normally mum that calls us. And by the time they get to us, they're just about, I mean, they're just done. They're exhausted. Um, so, I mean, from our perspective, it's really all hands on deck. So, how does it look like when a family calls you? I mean, what stage of the proceeding are they? Because obviously they may call you and they may not know about legal intervention. They may not even have thought about it, or if they do, the idea of turning what is a family issue into an adversarial proceeding is frankly a little frightening for them.
Yeah.
So, what does it look like from the clinical perspective? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So what happens is we get calls. We collaborate a lot with a lot of individuals around the United States. I believe in good collaboration and sort of, we just believe there's strength in collaborating. So we'll get a call from someone like happened yesterday. And this comes from somebody else in another sector of the country. Mom lives in the Northeast. Patient is here at a wellness center. But there's a lot of trauma in this case. She lost her father to addiction. She lost her brother to addiction all in the last 3 years, and is now developed a severe alcohol condition that has been she's not been able to get it under good control over the last 5 years. So she goes to treatment and leaves, and the patient happens to be in Florida. So we, took the initial call. It was referred to us by another entity and other intervention professionals. And we spoke to mom and we explained to her about these legal mediums that we have in Florida that we're very fortunate to have, including the Marchman Act. And we kind of talked a little bit about the Baker Act, and we talked a little bit about guardianship, but we said, we believe that your daughter's life's in danger because the daughter is drinking to the point of passing out and becoming unconscious and being taken to the hospital. So we explained to her that, if she is interested in using these potential methods to get her into treatment, that's something that we can certainly do. We often can do it in concert with an intervention when necessary, or we can just handle case management, family coaching. It just depends on what the family wants. And so how it works is we explain this to them. And yes, then there's an education period. So usually what we do is send them referencing information or send them to speak to one of your staff members to kind of find out more about what the specifics are going to look like, cost, time, etc., and let the families kind of come to some conclusions. We want to make sure they're comfortable with whatever they're doing, but we do explain that we know that Marchman Act often in cases saves lives. We know that it does. We know that it does because we've seen what happens with the families that call us and maybe are a little gun shy or don't want to do it. And oftentimes that ends tragically because, Mark, by the time they call us, usually the case is gotten to a place where your normal sort of methodologies may not work because they have been failing usually for 5, 10, 15 years. So that's kind of how that piece works. If they bring us aboard and they bring you aboard, then we get to work. We kind of prep them for the intervention, work in concert with your team, explaining all the steps we're going to take, and then we go in. And that's kind of how that process works.
Yeah, one of the things that we see a lot of when the family calls us is they're telling us the history, how long this has been going on for. And I think, at least from our perspective, the struggle that a lot of families have is they don't understand how their loved one can be doing what they're doing to themselves, right? And whether it's, using some type of recreational drug or abusing prescription medications, whatever it is, they say, we don't understand.
Yeah.
And, the way that we sort of describe it is in terms of what I call the kidnapped brain, right? It's as if their brain has been kidnapped. So they're not capable of saving themselves. And so there's two options, right? Either the family steps in and does what needs to be done to save them, or the state will probably do it for you. And in my experience, the state does not do a very good job, either through the criminal system or the mental health system. But maybe we can talk about from a clinical perspective, what does that dynamic look like? How do we explain clinically to a family, like what's really going on up here with their loved one? Why do they continue to do what they do? And why do they seem to be in denial? Why do they say there's nothing wrong with me? The problem's with my parents or my siblings or whoever it is. Yeah. Maybe we can explain that to us.
Sure. So depending on the case, if it's a high acuity mental health case, for example, and the patient often profiles that we have referred to us are schizophrenics, people with schizoaffective disorder. Clearly, these people these patients are suffering from a condition in which they are not capable of making good decisions. I mean, usually they're psychotic, they're hearing voices, they're seeing things that aren't there, and families don't really understand how that works. So part of what we do is educate them about the diagnosis, what the treatment plan looks like, and we give them referencing information. We ask them, go to NIDA, go to these outside sources and look and see what the empirically derived data around the country and independent entities would say to you about what the course of treatment is, so that they understand that we make our decisions from that perspective. If it's a substance abuse case, we try to help them understand that, essentially when someone has been abusing substances, depending on the substance and the age and the basal metabolic rate and a number of factors, but usually by the time they call us, as you were stating, there's transient damage that's done to the brain. We know that there's neurostructural changes, neurochemical changes that just do not allow the person to make good decisions for themselves. And as you're saying, whoever the closest family member is to them, they often fault that person, whether it's a husband, wife, parent, child, and say it's all their fault. There's nothing wrong with me. So we help them understand that because of those challenges, this person is probably going to be in danger. And we talk to them about previous cases we've had, what similar like profiles kind of look like in the way of treatment, and what happens if left untreated. I have to tell you, Mark, that usually by the time we're talking about what happens when they're untreated, they know, because they've already been through rounds of hospitalizations or their loved one disappearing or having to go look for them or putting a tracker on their phone and all the different things that families tell us. And we explain to them there's a way out. We have some families that call us that say, we just feel like this case is hopeless. And here's something I say to them, I'll say to you and to everyone listening, there is no such thing as a hopeless case. There's no such thing as a hopeless case. There's just strategy and treatment using the mediums we're talking about to help get that patient into the right facility. And here's the key: for the right amount of time. Because usually if the patient comes in and they're coming to us, they're usually already further down the road than, let's say, someone who has a drinking problem at 16 or 18 or 20. Usually they've progressed. So the other piece that the family member doesn't understand is that this is going to take time because of what we talked about, because of these neurostructural and neurochemical changes that require medication intervention, separation from the substances if it's a substance abuse case, or just a medication regime if it's somebody with a mental health condition. The other key is that oftentimes these patients are not taking care of themselves. They're not eating well, they're not hydrating properly. So there's usually a multitude of challenges that are happening, and finding the right facility for them and making sure that the family is aboard and the patient is aboard, keeping their loved ones there for the right amount of time is the key to success early in the process. And then, of course, the outpatient plan and what that looks like, and managing expectations. Mark, sometimes these family members will say to us, well, we're worried that our loved one is going to be angry at us. And I don't use a lot of inflammatory language or fear mongering, but I explain to them that A, they're not capable of making good decisions for themselves, and B, that often cases like these, if it's that profile, end badly. So we just try to help them understand, look, there's a way around that. But sometimes they don't want to act because they are afraid of how their loved one is going to perceive what happens. But this is usually a patient who is not really in charge of all of their mental faculties and putting themselves in harm's way.
Okay, so you bring up a couple of points. Let's talk about each one of them individually. In terms of time, because by the time a family reaches us, I mean, this has been going on for years and years and years. And sometimes a family will say, well, I just want to do 30 days. And I say, you've probably got the wrong lawyer, because I know from experience of handling hundreds of these cases, speaking to thousands of families, and being blessed to have somebody like you who not only is a good friend, but can give us that clinical outlook, that 30 days is just a disaster waiting to happen. And we tell them, think about this as a year-long project, at least from our perspective. Not that you have to hire us for a year, but this is a year-long journey. So maybe from the clinical perspective, Robert, tell us, explain to the audience, what does the treatment protocol look like when they come to work with you?
Yeah. So, I always want families and anyone asking to go and, I say, go fact check me, look at outside sources, because all of the data points to the fact that First of all, we've kind of gotten away from the 28-day model. The 28-day model was the original treatment center. That was the Hazelton Foundation, Minnesota, back in the 50s. And of course, that was the model at the time. And the thinking was, to some degree, that you establish habits in 28 days and so on and so forth. Since then, and we're talking about 70 years later, we know that there's transient neurological challenges. We know that post-acute withdrawal affects how someone is going to function in month 1, 2, 3, up to a year, 18 months, sometimes longer. And that those are the reasons why all of the empirically derived data and all of these sort of independent entities point to the fact that 90 days of treatment is usually what's sort of indicated. Now, it depends because every case is different. There may be a case where 30 days might work, but the cases we get usually are much further down the road. So what it would look like, Mark, in an ideal world is X amount of time of res, 45, 90 days, stepping down to PHP, IOP, outpatient, to have structure and support around that person, to have medication management and compliance, to have clinical support around them, to have someone coaching the parents. Because oftentimes when the patients start to get better, they'll start working their parents and saying, if it's a child, oh, bring me home, I'm so much better. And so we have to help the families manage all that. Of course, it's their loved one, and of course they want them to come home. But bringing them home prematurely or getting them out of treatment because the patient doesn't want to be there often can end in a disastrous way. So in the ideal world, Mark, what it would look like is going through all levels of care. And we know that patients that get to a year sober, that those patients go on to get multiple years sober. The PRN monitoring systems around our country that deal with pilots, impaired pilots, doctors, physicians, there's a lawyers group as well. They keep people for 5 years. And we know that their research and their studied documentation of these longitudinal studies show that 83% of those people, those patients, those participants go on to stay sober for life. So we know that time matters. And it's not just because I say it or you say it or it's some ploy. There's empirically derived data to support that, depending on the case and the profile, that going through these levels of care and having a good outpatient plan in place for the proper amount of time yields better outcomes.
So let's say somebody gets past a year, and one of the things that we've, my wife and I have been blessed, and for the audience, Robert also works with his wife, so maybe that's why we get along so well. We appreciate having our wives who, I know I couldn't build our law firm without my wife, and I know that you feel the same about Jen, your wife. So let's say somebody gets past a year. What happens then? Because we tell people, listen, recovery is not really a destination. It's more of a journey, right? And it's an ongoing journey. It's like, I just make a point. I go to the gym 4 mornings a week. I do it religiously. Sometimes those 4 days might change because of my schedule, but I'm going to do it because when I stop doing it, my body and my mind, turns to mush. So somebody gets past a year. What do they do? I mean, really, for the rest of their life, what are they supposed to be doing so they can maintain recovery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it depends on the case. If it's a mental health case, let's start with that, then certainly it's going to be medication management and clinical work, and depending on what level of support they need around them. And that's just the maintenance work, right? Once we've gotten through that first year, depending on the case, that's going to be what that's going to look like. If it's somebody who has a substance abuse problem, to your point, yeah, I mean, the maintenance goes on for a while. And certainly once the sort of, if there's a psychiatric component to the stabilization, the clinical piece, and then clearly we know that all the research indicates that socially sort of supportive groups that are designed to keep people connected to recovery resources like 12-step groups or Dharma or Smart Recovery, that being a part of those types of community-based support systems also yield better results. Now, some people may say, well, AA is not for me. That's okay. There's Smart Recovery, there's Dharma, there's many things. But staying in touch with those pieces as well as with professionals. Because listen, if somebody's been abusing substances for 15 or 20 years, they're not just going to, even if they get to a year, which is great. I mean, it's a great milestone, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're all out of the woods. Because I'm sure you've heard as well as I have that a patient had 2 years or 5 years or however many years they had, they relapse and then they end up in a bad way and they come to us. So all of the data supports good social support, connected clinical services, as well as an outside social system, in some cases AANA, whatever that might look like for them, and making sure that they have stayed connected. We know that patients that it doesn't end well for after a certain amount of time is usually because they disconnected from the very things that got them healthy to begin with. That's human nature. People sometimes don't want to continue to do things because they feel better. Much like a diabetic might say, I don't need this insulin anymore, and then get into a diabetic crisis because they just don't want to take it. And so there's a certain amount of maintenance. We know that this is a chronic condition. It doesn't have a cure, but it does have treatment. And so we know that if the person stays connected into those very things that got them well to begin with, and they stay connected to outside services, their chances greatly improve of long-term recovery.
Okay, so that brings up another issue, which is the whole substance use versus mental illness. So I know in February of 16, when we started doing this work, I mean, when it was just me, the idea of doing guardianship work wasn't even on the map. I mean, that really didn't come about until I met Audra, and she'd been doing guardianship work up in Massachusetts for about a dozen years.
Yeah.
And really, guardianship was designed for elderly people. It wasn't designed for what we use it for.
Right.
But thanks to my brilliant wife, we've been able to have tremendous success with guardianship. Yeah. But in February of 16, I dealt with really alcohol and recreational drug use cases. So the Marchman Act was, a key component of what we did. Yeah. Then two things changed that. Obviously COVID and the legalization of marijuana. And I think it's fair to say that the bulk of our cases, if not close to all of them, are dealing with severe and clinically challenging mental illness. I mean, am I right about that?
So there's been a notable and documented increase in prevalence rates of mental health conditions around the world, including the United States, secondary to just not knowing what was going to happen in the world next when we went through COVID. I mean, people were wondering if they were going to live, could they leave their house? Did they have to wear hazmat suits, if you recall, wipe down boxes, whatever it was. So the world was in a state of complete shock. And obviously that raises, what we know is that stress acutely exacerbates all conditions, medical, mental health, substance abuse conditions. And so to your point, we saw an uptick in a lot of conditions, and including mental health conditions. The other thing that happened that you made mention of is the legalization of cannabis. And we know that there has been a large uptick and increase in cannabis-induced psychotic cases, cannabis-induced severe depression cases and severe anxiety cases. And I know you know that because we've worked a lot of cases in that space where a person looks to be, has a similar symptom profile to a schizophrenic or someone with schizoaffective disorder, but the roots of it often are traced back to cannabis. Why is that happening? Well, you have three reasons. One, cannabis is no longer the cannabis of the 80s and 90s. Some estimates are showing 60 to 90% concentration of THC, a fat-soluble drug that stays in your system 30 days. So if you have a substance that stays in your system that long and it's so much stronger and you're using it around the clock. So one is the concentration. Two is the availability, because it's become so available around the United States that it's not very difficult for anyone to do it, nor is it against the law. And the third reason is because of the different methodologies of ingestion, right? The routes of ingestion. They can take edibles, they can smoke a little pipe. So they can essentially just use cannabis all day long. You have a fat-soluble drug, 90% concentration, using it all day long, and it changes what it does to your brain. We know that this is a phenomenon that's taking place, and we don't think most of the schools of thought are that it's not going to get any better because the legalization of cannabis is becoming more and more prevalent around the United States, and for medical use as well, which ultimately can be used for the same reason, to use it to abuse the substance. We're seeing about 20% of the population end up in situations where they are having acute mental health crises secondary to cannabis use. And we know there's certain profiles. One of the profiles is males between the ages of 18 and 25. So there are certain demographics where we're seeing it at much higher rates, but we're seeing it across the board.
Yeah. I was a child of the 80s growing up in the UK, and I had a lot of friends who used marijuana. They smoked it. And I'd be honest with you, when they talked about, and I use the word legalization loosely, but it's so, as you said, it's so readily available. It's so easy to get it even with the card. It's become a bit of a joke. But I didn't think it was going to be a big issue because, for the most part, my friends who smoked, just went on to have successful, productive lives.
Mhm.
And so when they said, "Oh, we're going to legalize it here in Florida," I was like, "Well, probably won't be that big of a deal." But I couldn't have been more wrong. And as you point out, I think it's been an unmitigated disaster, quite frankly, at least from a mental health perspective. I mean, it's going to keep us busy for years to come, and I think it's only going to get worse. So I guess from when we talk about choosing the right treatment center, right, the right treatment modality, does this legalized marijuana change the dynamics of what we're looking at in terms of where we could potentially place somebody and for how long?
Yeah, so a couple things. Let me be clear. Like anything else, alcohol is legal, but there's a certain percentage of people that have predispositions to have addiction, and therefore it's a challenge for that. Some estimates are 20%, others are about 8 to 10%, and those numbers are changing post-COVID. But what we're saying is, listen, this is what happens. Like, we've had many sort of epidemics through the years, and I'm not choosing for or against the legalization, only noting what's happening. But is it changing what we can do? Absolutely, because there are certain facilities that are not equipped, designed, or staffed, nor do they want to handle patients who have psychosis. And because the cannabis-induced psychotic cases are to a large degree showing up with severe psychosis, it limits our ability to place them there because, again, they're not staffed, equipped, and designed to handle those cases. What I will tell you, in keeping in contact with facilities around the country, is that that's changing. They are beginning to change their staff, their training. They're looking for people with more mental health training, because if you're a treatment center and you just negate those higher acuity cases, it's going to be challenging to continue in business, because they're all telling me, and I'm talking about every corner of the US, Mark, from California to New York to Utah to right here in Florida, that they are all seeing a huge uptick in mental health cases secondary to cannabis-induced psychosis. So they are retraining their staff, hiring new staff to get ready for what we believe, and I know you and I have talked about this, is going to be another wave and continue to be a real challenge for our system.
Yeah, when I first started using the Marchman Act, I mean, the Marchman Act contemplates, primary substance use with co-occurring mental illness, and obviously one of the big changes over the years for the Marchman Act has been they added in that co-occurring piece,
Right.
and so it kind of contemplates that there could be some mental illness going on here. But in 16, it was a very easy line to draw in the sand, right? This is a recreational drug use
Right.
case, or there's too much drinking on here.
Right.
But to me, it seems like the lines have been really blurred
Yes.
in the last few years. So how do you, from a clinical perspective, I mean, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it mental illness driven by marijuana use, or are they using marijuana because they don't feel well? I mean, how do we make that distinction? And does it really matter whether we do or don't?
Great question. So the truth is that you're going to look at three things. Well, first of all, getting a good family history is going to give you some answers, but not all of the answers. And to your point, it doesn't change entirely what we would do in the way of treatment planning and placement services, but it does affect it. So the question becomes, right, what is the etiology of the psychosis? Is it that they had a pre-existing condition and the cannabis acutely exacerbated that condition? Is the cannabis causing that condition? Or were they going to have this condition anyway, and it just so happened that they started using cannabis at 22, which is, the early 20s is a commonality in terms of the onset of psychosis. But so one of the things you'll look at is family history. Usually when there's a predisposition, you will find somewhere that someone else in the family has some form of mental illness, and usually even in the way of psychosis. I had a case, an Adderall-induced psychotic case, where it was clear that there was lineage in the family, the uncle, the father, an aunt, who had pre-existing psychotic documented diagnoses. So even though the Adderall was making this particular patient psychotic, we think it was rooted in an underlying condition. But to your point, does it change the treatment plan? No, because we have to separate that patient from the substance, get that patient on an antipsychotic regime, if that's what's warranted as per the medical team. But what it does is it complicates the cases. It makes them more challenging because, again, not all facilities are equipped to handle somebody that's psychotic regardless of etiology. So that's kind of the answer to that. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It does. And like to your point, I think it's only going to get worse. Okay, let's switch gears for a second.
Sure.
So as I mentioned, a lot of the time we're getting calls from families, and it's typically mom that calls. But one of the dynamics that we see sometimes is that, mom says, this, she takes one position and dad takes the other. And dad might say, well, look, I'm done. We've spent a lot of time, energy, and money. I'm not spending any money on treatment. I'm not spending money on a lawyer. I'm done. I'm going to cut this individual off, and he or she can do whatever they want, right? And obviously the concern is they're either going to be homeless because the dad's cutting off the money, or they're going to be couch surfing. Mom says, no, I don't want to do that because I don't want my child living on the streets or couch surfing. I won't know what's going on with them. And so we're not going to cut off the money. My position has always been that the goal here is to get them into treatment, and neither one of those two things is really going to help us to get that person to treatment. But a lot of the time we have the parents butting heads. And it's certainly my philosophy that unless you can get both family members, or at least the decision makers, on the same page, you just really can't move forward. So how do you deal with that family dynamic where one parent says yes and the other one says no? Yeah. Because sometimes by the time they get to us, they're tired. They are really spent.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that? Because obviously, if, like you said, there's no such thing as no hope, right? So how do we get over that? How do we deal with that family dynamic?
Yeah. So a couple of things, and let me just pivot back to the psychotic piece because I forgot to make mention of just one thing, and that is that oftentimes there is other underlying general medical conditions, traumatic brain injuries. There are about 10 potential factors that can cause psychosis. So we look to rule those things out. To your question, to your current question. It's not easy, Mark. There's definitely some craft that's involved in this, but I will tell you that if I had to give a standard answer for everyone, here's the most important piece. One is education and support. Families often are making those decisions, to your point, because they're frustrated, they're tired, they've already spent money. So what we offer them is education and support about their loved one's condition, about possible treatment plans, a path forward. And so that's what we can do. And to your point, sometimes they're not ready for their own reasons. And we don't want to try to make them ready. Our goal is to support, educate them, and let them come to the place they need to come to. I would say that 8 times out of 10, they get there. It might not be that call. It might not be that month. But a lot of times then, as time goes by, especially because in that education and support, we give them outside referencing information so that they can do the reading, so that they can learn about the conditions, the treatment, the formularies, the outcomes, what it looks like, the risks, benefits, so that they fully understand what needs to be done. And so if we're able to do that successfully, usually we can get them to turn a corner and take some action. But to your point, Mark, there are some instances where families will say, well, we think that, these sort of tough love and sort of these 80s models might work. The challenge is what we've discussed, right? If you have somebody who's floridly psychotic on cannabis, those types of models don't work because if you're waiting for insight or buy-in, you may never get it. And the other thing I say to them is, if I think it's warranted is, are you ready for these possible consequences? Because this is typically how these cases progress, whatever that might look like, homelessness or prison or even mortality in certain extreme cases. And so I just say to them, look, this is kind of, and don't take it from me. Let's go to some outside sources and look at what the research shows in cases like this. And my experience is this. Then we educate them and let them land on a decision that makes sense for them and their families.
Yeah, sometimes families will call and they say, well, we don't want to force our loved one into treatment. And I totally get that. And my philosophy is we're not forcing anybody to do anything. You're making the decision they cannot make for themselves, right? And they say, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wait for him or her to hit rock bottom. And my response to that is, well, if they hit rock bottom might be that they end up dead. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, right? Because that's how sick they are.
Yeah.
my philosophy is that it's not about their loved one hitting rock bottom. It's about the family, the decision makers, mom and dad hitting rock bottom, getting to the point where they're so sick and tired of being so sick and tired that they're going to make that commitment.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what we see. So, how do we, again, from a clinical perspective, how do we address that with the family? How do we know when the parents have really hit rock bottom that they're willing to take that leap of faith with us and make the commitment to save this person?
It's a great question. And I would say to your question, we know when they're willing to act. But again, if they're not willing to act, the best we can do is offer support and education to them. Sometimes they may want to bring us on just to help them through that process, because Mark, the family system is, when we're working with any patient, it's an entire dynamic within the entire system. And what I like to explain to the families is it's like a human cell. The cell is constantly looking for homeostasis. Some things in, some things out. The entire body is always looking to balance itself out. There are thousands of things the body does every day to do this. And so we have to explain to the family that until they're ready to act, explaining all the sort of risks and benefits. But we do our best to educate them about patients with similar like profiles end up in these types of conditions or those types of conditions. Sometimes families may say, well, okay, well, if that's the way it goes, that's the way it goes. But we've done our job to educate them and support them and leave that door open if they should need to return. We know they're ready, Mark, that they've hit rock bottom when they call and they act, because we also have those families. We have families that call and say, okay, we're ready to go, and they go. The other piece is that we often want the family to get connected to clinical services as well, which we don't provide in-house, but we connect them to outside sources, whatever those sources may be, for further education, support, clinical guidance. What does that look like? It could be NAMI, it could be Al-Anon, it could be an individual therapist, a family therapist, because usually there are many dynamics playing out in these families. So we don't really treat a patient in the way of just dealing with one person. We really do deal with the entire family system.
Yeah, somebody just made a post. I'll go over that in a second. Thank you, David. So let's talk about, you mentioned the word interventions. So, I always tell families, look, if you call and speak to us, our goal, our mission is to give you some options, right? I'm not here to judge. It's a no judgment zone when you call us, because God only knows by the time the parents call us, there's sometimes tremendous feelings of guilt, like they did something wrong, or they were a bad parent, or they had, bad genetics and it caused this to happen to their loved one.
Right.
This is not about assigning fault. It's a no judgment zone when you call us. And also it's about giving the families options, right? I'm not here to tell you what to do with your loved one. I'm going to give you some options and you'll decide, as my late father used to tell me, I'm going to give you some options and you're going to decide what is right for your family.
Right.
Now, sometimes the family's not ready to really go down the legal pathway, which might mean we are getting a court order to have their loved one taken by law enforcement, the police, to a receiving facility. And sometimes what works, and I'm a big fan of, is the intervention process. And I know that word gets sort of bandied around, and there's interventionists like you, and then there's other interventionists. And again, I'm not here to poo-poo anybody, but there's a difference between somebody who has a PhD and somebody who took a 10-hour course online. I mean, there just is a difference. So maybe we could talk about what does that mean? Talk about what it means, what it looks like, and what the benefits can be of doing an intervention, as opposed to, okay, let's do a Marchman Act, let's do a guardianship. Yeah. And how maybe we get to, okay, now we've done the intervention, let's talk about how we integrate Marchman and guardianship as part of the solution.
It's just interesting that you asked this question, because this literally came up yesterday. And so one of the things that we do, Mark, again, is we review medical and clinical information, and we do an exhaustive sort of review of what's happening with the patient. So that's one potential difference. I don't know how other people, engage in their craft. And again, no judgment to them. But clearly, if you have more training in the mental health field and you've had extensive experience with high acuity cases throughout the entirety of your career, then it gives you a little bit more insight, if not a lot more insight, into what's happening with this patient, what's happening with the family, and the proper placement. what does it look like? Well, once we've gathered all the information, the next step we're going to give them is the tools, the way we discussed. And if they're not ready, or it's not appropriate to go to Marchman or Baker or Guardian in that moment, we start talking about options for treatment. Once we've landed there, we'll start prepping them. So what does that look like? That looks like who's going to be there, what's the day and time and location, and then we give them specific language. I don't even know that I like the word intervention. I mean, what we're looking to do is propagate a change in trajectory, right? We're looking to go in and get this patient moving a few degrees differently than where they were, to try to get them somewhere else 500, 1,000 miles down the road. And so this is really about getting the family aboard, unified, getting the messaging unified of love, support, encouragement. We invite the patient in when we can. In some instances, you can't. It just depends on the case. And then we go in. And I'll tell you that most of the time we can get them to go. Not every single time, because that's impossible. Sometimes we have to go back 2 or 3 times, especially when there's a mental health component to it. And so as long as the family's unified, the message is unifying, and it's a loving, supportive sort of way of doing this, we find that we've had great success this way. In relation to incorporating the Marchman Act, well, it's what we've talked about. Sometimes we can get them in, but keeping them in may be a challenge. And that's what happened in this case yesterday. Is I told the mom, okay, there's a good shot we can get her to the facility. But because she has a history of absconding out of the last 6 facilities, and then drinking and relapsing and putting herself in harm's way to the point of passing out, having alcohol poisoning, ending up in the hospital, we then would call someone like you and say, okay, look, we've got her in this place. Can we now look at a Marchman Act? Or if needed, if the parent is so inclined and we feel that it meets the criteria of possibly a guardianship, to help have this mom get her hands around this patient and help her save her own life. I mean, you're talking about somebody who lost her father, lost her brother, and saw a friend jump in front of a train, all in the last 5 years. Tremendous amounts of trauma, a tremendous history in the family of addiction. So, this is a pretty egregious case. And so, to your question, we do all the prep work on the front end, gather the diagnostic criteria, find the facility, let the family decide, go in, sort of execute the intervention, and then work in concert sometimes with you for the intervention, for a Baker Act if needed. I mean, I have gotten calls where we go out and somebody is floored legal. There was one, I don't know, not that long ago, and she had been on crystal methamphetamine for 3 days and was psychotic in a house, walking around, talking to herself. And so, we had to get in and do the whole Baker Act. But that girl is safe today. Months later, that girl is safe, and she wasn't. The family was outside of her home crying and saying, we just don't know what to do. And I said, well, there's a way. And again, no one wants to do this to a loved one, but sometimes it's required because the alternatives are not good. So
yeah. Oh, let's talk about the Baker Act, and for the folks who are not in our arena, I mean, we typically operate under 3 statutes. Marchman Act, which is a statute here in Florida that allows us to basically put somebody into treatment for periods of up to 90 days where there's a primary substance use disorder. Guardianship is really a statute that we use, and as I mentioned, it really was designed for elderly people, but we have tailored it to our behavioral health cases where it's not just that there may be substance use or mental illness. It's more of, we need a whole lot more control, because Marchman Act is great, but it is very narrow in its relief, meaning it's just an order that says you'll go to treatment for 90 days. We can't get access to medical records. We can't restrict where they live, who they spend time with, restrict their ability to travel, take away a driver's license, all of that stuff, which can be done with the guardianship. The Baker Act, which, I mean, and I've been pretty public about this. I had a family member that was Baker Acted, and it happened just a couple of days after I lost my dad. And it's been a bit of a mission of mine, because in my opinion, the mental health system, at least here in Florida, the state system, is pretty draconian and broken. And it's very easy to get sucked into the system using the Baker Act, which is a statute that authorizes the state to basically take custody of somebody when there's an allegation of some form of mental illness and they need immediate crisis intervention. However, when it's done correctly, the Baker Act is a very powerful, life-saving legal intervention. And I'm a fan of it when it's done right. And when I say right, I mean somebody like Robert comes along and does it. And so maybe just because every state has a version of the Baker Act, and we call it Baker Act, by the way, because it's named after somebody whose last name was Baker. And we call the Marchman Act because, again, that statute was named after somebody whose last name was Marchman, right? So, but every state has a version of the Baker Act. Not every state has a version of the Marchman Act. I think Marchman's pretty unique to Florida. But let's talk about the Baker Act. Because I know that you can initiate an immediate detention of somebody. Talk to me about what that looks like and when we might use it and why it's such a powerful life-saving tool.
Sure. So a couple things to your point. Yes, every state has, it's just an involuntary psychiatric examination, and every state has a version of it. Though a very smart man once said to me, know your state, know your county, know your judge, because how those laws are interpreted and how they are executed varies from state to state. And because I do interventions all around the U.S., I have seen the variances in how those laws are interpreted. In the state of Florida, the Baker Act might be instituted in a situation where you're going in for an intervention and someone basically meets the criteria. Is this person an imminent threat to themselves or others? I know that everyone always thinks homicidal, suicidal, psychotic, and yes, that plays in. But the statute is very clear, and I know you know it probably better than most, if not than anyone I know personally. And so the language is clear. So if the patient meets that criteria and I believe them to be in danger for their life or the lives of others, or they're so gravely mentally ill they're going to suffer harm and neglect, then we can institute it. It depends. We certainly will try other methods. I'm a least restrictive method person. I do not like to go to guns first if I don't have to, but there are instances where we have to, like that patient that I just told you about who had been in that house for like 2 weeks and walking around without eating and naked and guns and all kinds of terrible things. And the family just didn't know what to do because the police couldn't breach her door because she hadn't committed a crime per se. So we had to be very tactful in getting her to open the door, allowing her to talk to me, and then we were able to get her safe. To your question, somebody already had started a Marchman Act. So it started with the Baker, and when that was done, she was transferred to a substance abuse treatment facility and then remained in treatment for a period of time, and I'm told is now doing very, very well. So these tools can be quite effective if used properly, but like anything else, sometimes sometimes they're used improperly, whether nefarious or inadvertent on the part of a professional or a family member or law enforcement, and I don't know. But if you are using the criteria that's listed out and it's done the right way, as well as letting a family member know, that's another thing. And I know you've talked about that, is making sure the family member knows A, she's Baker acted, and B, or he, and where they're going, because then the family knows where she is, they know what's going on, and then they have more. There's more of an ability for them to kind of maneuver with the case, as opposed to what I've heard you talk about in the past, which is where someone is Baker acted, and because there's no releases, no one knows where they went. They just kind of disappear and can then be picked up by the state.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny. I was talking to a group of clinicians at a local treatment center, and one of the ways you can get Baker Act is by somebody like you, which is who's defined as a qualified professional,
right?
And you can issue what's known as a professional certificate, which is that 1 or 2 page document that says this person meets criteria. Sheriff, take this person to the nearest receiving facility.
Right.
And I said to them, look, when it's done by a clinician, I'm okay with it, because at least that way we know where the person's going. There's typically going to be some follow-up, right? So, because we don't want to leave them in the hands of the state. We just need that immediate crisis intervention.
That's right.
The problems that I see is where law enforcement is called to the scene, they are, under the statute, authorized to make that clinical decision. They detain the person, they take them to a receiving facility, and then either the police don't want to tell the family where the person's going, or they say, look, they're going to XYZ receiving facility. They get there, and then the receiving facility doesn't want to talk to the family, and now nobody knows what's going on, and it's a complete disaster. So, I mean, that's why I say there's occasionally there's an issue with the Baker Act.
Yeah.
But when it's done right, it's a really neat piece of legislation that helps us.
Of course.
So one other thing, and then I'm gonna let you go.
Sure.
One of the things that we have seen a lot of is that when we're dealing with, especially with somebody with severe mental illness, and I think the marijuana ties into this, is at some point somewhere when this individual was probably preteen, they were diagnosed some type of medication. And I know this might be a little bit of a hot button topic, so I apologize for putting you on the spot, but we see a lot of adult children who, when they were 6, 7, 8, somebody said they have a mental health issue, right? ADD, ADHD, and they prescribed them a medication.
Yeah.
And that, from what I am seeing, can be the slippery slope to the beginning of some serious issues when they reach adulthood. And I wondered if you had any opinion on that and how you think that might be affecting things.
So because I started my career in the child and adolescent inpatient psychiatric world, I can speak about this and sort of tell you what I think. And what I think is that there are certain childhood and adolescent conditions that do require medication intervention, and if they don't get it, then it's like anything else. You look at the benefits of the medication and the side effect profiles, as well as what will happen if they're not medicated. So, for example, and I know it's a common one, is this patient may have ADHD. But what we know is that ADHD untreated loads highly with conduct disorder, which can turn into antisocial personality disorder. It loads highly with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. So if we leave a patient who really needs the medication untreated, those are the possible challenges. But like anything else, Mark, sometimes when a diagnosis becomes more recognized, there may be, and again, I'm just giving you my unabated thoughts, there may be opportunists. There may be people who jump to that medication faster than maybe they should. And so I think that, like anything else, everything has its place as long as it's done properly by responsible clinicians and providers, medication providers, because I've seen physicians do great work, but I've also seen instances where, to your point, maybe they didn't, and that can open the door to other addictive appetites. One might argue that somebody who already has predispositions would end up there anyway, and that argument is still out, different schools of thought. But if what you're suggesting is, are there instances where people may be improperly medicated that then plays into a mental health condition and addictive processes? Yes, that's certainly possible. But I would say that more often than not, if they're responsible providers, usually give all of those sort of risks and benefits to the family and let them make that decision. But now we're talking about sometimes kids just take their medications and abuse them as well, right? So if you have a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old who's in college and gets Adderall and is snorting it on the weekends for fun, well, then that changes the dynamic of what the drug was originally designed for. I think anything else, like anything else, medication has its place. It is a tool. It is not a solution, but in some cases it's warranted and necessary. But like anything else, yes, there are abuses on all sides, from the patients to the providers. And I think it is a phenomenon that occurs and certainly has to be monitored and watched by the families primarily. Yeah.
Okay. We have literally about 2 minutes to go. David posted something here, and I wanted to just share this because I think it was a good point. David wrote, "I don't make guarantees to families except for this. If you follow the process and recommendations, you may at least believe at the end of the day that you've done everything you could.
That's right.
That peace of mind may be the ticket to get the ball rolling." I think that's an excellent point, David. It really is. Yeah, I think that's, and I tell families, look, look, as lawyers, ethically, we can't make guarantees or promises. The Florida bar would not be happy with me. But I tell families, look, if you work the program, there's a really great chance here that this nightmare could be over. But the program is probably, as you point out, a year-long process. And what I tell families is, look, I have hope for you, right? But yeah, it's going to take a little bit of a leap of faith that if you follow the program, it's going to work out. And most of the time it does. Where things go sideways is when a family pulls the plug, and because their loved one's only been in treatment for 30 to 45 days, and like, well, he's fine. He says he's got it. He doesn't got it because he's never had it. And, and this has gone on for, this sort of, in and out, in and out has gone on for a long time, and he does not have it. He thinks he has it. Well, probably because he's in treatment and he's not using and he's been medically stabilized. So I think, David, your point is really well taken, and I appreciate you posting. We have about 60 seconds to go. I would invite other people to post comments if you want, if you can or you want to. Robert, tell the viewers how would they find you? I mean, obviously you can call me, but listen, I would encourage families to call you and go direct to the source because you're just such a wealth of information. How do they find you? Is there a good phone number? Is there a website?
Yeah, we have a website. It's I think it's axiomhealthservices.com. I'm going to look that up for you right now, as well as give you the phone number. My apologies for not being prepared on that end. I'll get that for you very quickly. And then our phone number is 561-698-1177. Or again, our website at axiomhealthservices.com. And by the way, we get a lot of calls to just collaborate with like-minded professionals around the country, and we do the same. So even if it's just to throw something around, we're always happy and enjoy collaborating with other like-minded professionals around the U.S. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for the folks that want to call us, our main website is mentalhealthaddictionlawfirm.com. That's mentalhealthaddictionlawfirm.com. The main number to the office is 561-419-6095. That's 561-419. You're welcome, Raja. 561-419-6095. And if you can't find us through either of those, just Google my name. I think I have about 600 videos out on YouTube because I want you guys to get the information you need, and you shouldn't have to pay for it. So you'll find me online. And Robert, thank you for taking this hour with me. You know, I love you. You're a brother and a friend, and you're making me look good every single day because of the amazing work that you do. But recovery is a journey; it's not a destination. And I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the viewers for taking time out of your day to spend an hour with me and Robert. And with that said, see you guys next month. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you very much, Mark.